What's up, everybody, wherever you may be in life's journey? I'm glad that I get to be here with you and that you are here on this earth. Welcome to another edition of the Rise to the Occasion podcast. I'm Jack Beers, and this is another edition of our interview series, or really the conversation series is probably more like it. And as I like to remind everybody when I do these conversation podcasts, it's a clear sign of my own selfishness because I am speaking with people who uh, have mentored me and/or who are really going to help me break down something that I've been thinking about in an attempt to become a better husband, father, and professional. And this is our first two-time guest, Brian Honsberger. What's up, Brian? How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Brian is
Thanks
Brian's
for
a
having me, Jack.
oh, always good to have you, Brian. This podcast has been an incentive for us to talk more frequently. So it is just giving me gifts I didn't anticipate. Um, so Brian is a professor. He teaches. Is it biblical theology? Is that what you teach? Is it no? What do you
All
teach?
kinds of stuff. But I run a program for Seton Hall University's seminary called Immaculate Conception. And it's a certificate in Catholic evangelization, master's level. And there's biblical studies, there's evangelization studies, theology, all kinds of stuff.
Brian's been in diocesan work for a long time now. 13, 14, 15 years, has a degree in biblical theology, and spent time in the secular world in finance, and is my go-to guy, probably the main person we're going to be talking about today, is my go-to guy whenever I want to learn something from St. Paul, and really is uh, an expert for me, at least in St. Paul. And the conversation that I wanted to have, and it was actually triggered by something you said the last time we chatted, is that you model yourself professionally after St. Paul. And it got me thinking about a phrase that I've started saying, which is um, like, we all have mentors. Consciously or unconsciously, we all have mentors. We all have people who we try to model different aspects of our lives after, and that most of the time it's unconscious, and we want to bring it to the level of consciousness and intentionality, because who mentors us is actually a glimpse of who we end up becoming. I remember my first experience of this, Brian, and as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking back to my first realization that people model other people, and that it isn't always a good thing, that it sort of happens unconsciously, and it isn't always a good thing. uh, Hopefully by the end of this, we're talking about the ways in which it's a good thing, and how you can do it, all that stuff. But I remember, like, my first crush, the first girl I really liked, and she was like, she would always come in like these pretty bright, happy outfits. And then she fell in love with the music band Green Day. And like a month into loving Green Day, it was all this dark, moody, like punk rock stuff. And her personality started to change. And I was like, who is this person that I had this big crush on? And it was this big heartbreak for me, because she started modeling herself after really the fans of Green Day, or the image of Green Day in it being particular. So modeling is powerful. It's really, really, really powerful. So what do you think about conscious versus unconscious modeling, and how do you see that in your own work?
Hmm. It's a good question. I feel like I can say a lot about modeling. I caught myself modeling first, I think, in like middle school. And yeah, I feel like I think when you're a kid, you put a certain emphasis on your social standing, consciously or subconsciously, and in a desire for like social, either social survival or social progression, you as long as you're observant enough and willing enough to change, you're observing your social scene, and you're trying to either like stay in a certain group or move up in a certain group and like belong to a tribe, if you will. And there's a lot of imitation going on there, and it all has to do with like social standing and so forth. Psychologists have done a lot of work on this, and it's just something I started to observe about myself. Like, I remember starting to listen to music that I did not particularly like because the group of people that I wanted to be with on a regular basis, they listened to that type of music. And then I thought to myself, like, that's a little like disingenuous, Brian. Talking to myself. So it was an opportunity for me to kind of begin that discernment. And who knows what grade that was, seventh, eighth grade. Um, but yeah, I noticed that about myself. And I also noticed that there's different phases in that with people. So I feel like early on in your life, it's your parents that you're imitating, maybe your siblings, and then you're released into a wider world. It's usually the educational environment that's second. And then once school is over, I want to add sports to the educational thing. And then finally, there's the work life, the work world. And in a secular environment where there's a lot of bad role models out there, going to scripture is oftentimes helpful, which is why I think we're talking today. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so from a psychological developmental perspective, like my kids are both in this place right now where like my son wanted a watch for his birthday because I wear a watch, right? And it's also we end up trying to model our parents because we can't differentiate between our parents and God. And so we end up being like, okay, this is how you're supposed to be in the world, and this is how the world works. And then you
Mhm.
start to reach that prepubescent to adolescent age, and you start individuating. And there are different moments of individuation. Like, one of the reasons why 2 and 3 year olds are so difficult is because they're starting to individuate for the first time by seeing what rules work and what rules don't work, right?
They're
And then
testing.
yeah, and biologically they're incentivized to do it. Like, 2 year olds have the highest hormone levels to create conflict and to do all different kinds of stuff. It's
I know.
why some of the most yeah right some of the most narcissistic people on the planet are 2 year olds who have a tendency to really push boundaries. We both know that. We both have children of those ages. But once you get, I forget the psychologist who talked about this. It might have been Skinner, where he's like, it's developmentally sound when you start to get to that 7, 8, 9, 10, and you need a mate, you need a friend. He calls them chums, and that it's really important for you to have a chum relationship. And oftentimes, if you don't have same sex chums, and if you don't end up having strong same sex chums, it can actually develop into different relational problems. Like, a same sex chum in that period is really, really important. And then you end up developing romantic interests in the 12, 13, 14 range, and your hormones change again. And then your modeling ends up being aspirational, right? Like, the chum age, it's like I want to model how I can be friends with these people I want to be friends with, and how we end up morphing together. When you're like 12, 13, 14, and you're like, okay, that type of person gets the girl, I'm going to start modeling that type of person, you know? And then And then you keep going and you start entering into early adulthood, and there ends up being a push for individuality, whether that is a push out of social structures, right? You're not popular, so you end up being pushed out of it, or whether it's because you end up becoming a leader and you want to be individualistic. And then comes the moment of failure, where you know that you can't do everything. A lot of people will experience this when they first become parents. Like, oh, I'm not invincible, and I can't do everything. And that's a lot of times when people start being like, I should start thinking about my spirituality. Or at least historically that's been the case, because it's like, well, I need to model someone, or I need the help of someone who can actually help me do this thing I don't think I can do. So that's sort of like the psychological trajectory that most people go along, for modeling.
Well put. I've never really heard that spelled out like that before. So I
It's
think
why
that's
it's healthy. It's why it's healthy when your 3-year-old is like driving you nuts. It's actually developmentally good. Or like it's developmentally good if your daughter comes in and wants to marry dad. Like that's development. That's a strong attachment. And that's good relationally. When son is trying to like wear dad's shoes, that's really good developmentally at 3 or 4, even if they confuse you because they then don't do what you tell them to do, right? So it's kind of hard. But I want to get into a little bit here. Like, when did you first like consciously start choosing who to model, and what are some of the fruits and dangers? What were some of the fruits and dangers of that for you when you first started modeling?
I think that the modeling started, as I mentioned before, in middle school, and this is an undeveloped conscience that we're talking about here, and a very undeveloped brain at that point. So major philosophical, theological, and maturity deficiencies, right, at that time. But still, I think it was very good to observe other people and to glean, to use a biblical word, to glean, or to winnow, let's say, to remove the things that are unappealing, and to kind of pick up the things that are appealing, and to grow in that sense. So observing the people around you, saying, okay, well, what's working, what's not, and to imitate what's working and to not imitate what's not, right? And I think that some people are more observant than others. Others are more stubborn than others, and they're going to say early on, like, oh, this is me and I'm going to be me, and screw other people. If they don't like me, then that's okay. You know what I mean? But yeah, I feel like at some point I came to realize that the most socially acceptable people are one of a few things. They're either really kind, they're either really funny, or they don't care. So,
What about talent?
oftentimes,
What about talent?
yeah, talent helps a lot. Yep. But I
Attractiveness
used to
too.
being attractive, but I remember eventually I remember observing that eventually the people who were very physically attractive, but otherwise nothing, to write home about, they were eventually disliked. Same thing with talenting. You could, like, let's say, we had a really good athlete in our school who was a phenomenal athlete, but otherwise not great, and eventually was kind of despised communally because of that. So, I feel like a combination of things is important, but one of the sexiest things, I think, at the high school era was not caring about what other people think about you. That is kind of like that was kind of the ultimate sense of cool. And once you were able to reach that level, then all of a sudden people gravitated to you. I noticed that.
Did that happen to you? Were you a I don't care about what people think person?
Oh, I think I developed in high school throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I could give you a whole autobiography about that, but I went from not being known, but being really maybe I was known for just being tall and goofy. I was always the tallest guy or whatever. But yeah, I eventually was able to uh, grow in my relationships, and definitely I was comfortable in my own skin by the time I graduated, for sure.
So when did St. Paul come in?
College for me. Yeah, college. I don't feel like I knew St. Paul at all. Like he was the confusing guy in the second reading at mass until I was maybe a sophomore in college. And then yeah, basically from age 22 until age whatever I am now. We're talking 20 so years. I've gotten to know Paul more and more, and the more I've known him, the more I have found myself emulating him. Not because it was a conscious choice, but because he was so appealing. Of course, we're trying to imitate Christ, right? Um, it is sometimes difficult to differentiate the human and the divine in Jesus, and to know where one ends and one begins. So emulating Paul, we know he was 100% human and 0% divine. Like, he was such an imperfect person. So his weaknesses are just so obvious, and his strengths become apparent. And the way that he was able to kind of trust in God's power in his weaknesses, and then really, really, to use a terrible modern word, he was really able to capitalize on what he was good at, on his strengths and his skill sets. Uh, yeah, so I feel like that's very, very easy to, like, I don't know, to understand and to emulate.
Do you know what was first attractive about him? Like either a quality or something that he would talk about that was really attractive for you?
Well, I suppose I would say maybe it's about a dozen things that are kind of equal in my opinion. So it wasn't like one thing. It wasn't like the teenager Brian saying like, "Oh, that one thing that guy does is cool. Let me copy that." You know what I mean? It was
Sure.
more of like I got to know him as a person, and I'm like, "Oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting." And after I realized that he had a number of very interesting qualities and aspects and virtues, and like, yeah, that it did rhyme with my own. Also, I suppose if I had to choose one, he's a very masculine person, very masculine person, and to me, he embodies uh, like the masculine spirituality.
Say more
You know what I
about that.
mean?
In what ways does he embody masculine spirituality?
Well, I think he's very courageous and not at all afraid of death. For example, he's willing to put his life on the line for what he believes in. To me, and he writes about this in Ephesians. Like, how does a husband model? Who is a husband's model in many ways? It's Jesus, right? Jesus being that person who's willing to uh, pour out himself like a libation. Like, are you familiar with the word kenosis? It's
Explain it.
it's Kenosis is the Greek word for self-emptying. So imagine I have this coffee cup full of coffee, and instead of drinking it because it's delicious, I were to just pour it out and empty it as a libation or as a sacrifice, as an act of worship, right? So Jesus is kind of, St. Paul describes Jesus as being this kenotic figure who, as he's on the cross, he empties himself, like he's pierced in the side, and what comes out, all the liquids, the blood, the water, it all comes out, it's poured out onto the ground. And it's almost like he's this cup that's been poured out, and he, what's the most masculine thing a guy can do is find his vocation, right? Find his bride, and then pour himself out, expend himself for the other. That's the only thing that really brings salvation, not salvation, it's the only thing that brings satisfaction to a man, is to find something to totally pour himself out into and then to do so. Right? Total self-sacrifice.
It's one of the differentiating things. Like, I was having a conversation with someone, and it was one of those conversations where it was like, it was not appropriate for me to get into a theological or philosophical debate with the person. So I was trying to walk the line of, like, I'm not going to nod at what you're saying. I'm going to acknowledge it, but but you're going to kind of know that I'm not fully on board with what you're saying. And the person I was talking to was someone who was there's value in all religions, and they really are kind of ultimately about, one or two things. And, I don't really need to, I don't really, I don't necessarily assign myself to one. I'm just kind of like a spiritual person, and I try to follow being a good, kind
heard it a
person,
million
right?
times.
Heard it a million times, right? So it's that type of vibe. And, I'm like, just like nodding, like, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I understand likely where that's coming from. But, like, one of the main differentiators of Jesus is everything that you're talking about right now. Other world religions, other philosophies, other gurus, they all stop at the same point that Jesus pressed on beyond. They stop at the point of self-possession. Like, Stoicism has become really popular in the modern age. And Stoicism is, Ryan Holiday has almost single-handedly brought it back to notoriety. And the limitation of Stoicism is that there are a number of them, but the main one is that it's like, you can become self-possessed to the point where you need no one. And you can be everything that you need unto yourself. And that you can, the end is to be a master of self. That's the end. And Jesus doesn't stop there. Jesus is like, no, human fulfillment isn't this radical individuality and sort of radical concept of mastering the self. It's actually, you possess yourself to give yourself.
Right. And you don't even really understand yourself until you give yourself away.
There's a dynamic to it.
Yeah.
And there's there are different moments in different seasons where it's like, hey, you've really got to get a hold of that thing. But because you can't, and the reason why it's dynamic is because you can't look at the spiritual life as linear. You're constantly ebbing and flowing between different stages of the spiritual life, where it's like, okay, I really need to have self-mastery because this sin is ruining my life. It's like, okay, well, self-mastery should be really important there. Like, I'm conceited. If I'm conceited and everything is about me, and I'm only introspective and only thinking about me, it's like, well, what do you need to do? You need to go pour yourself out somewhere. And, like, you need to kind of have both. But Jesus is really the only one in the Judeo-Christian tradition who has just nailed this down, which is like, blessedness on earth is self-gift. the objective of life is self-gift. And I think St. John Paul II talked about this the most of any pope, like become a self-gift. Like how you become who you are is to become a self-gift. This is why the universal vocation is love, and love is an outpouring of self. So
and it's particularly masculine in my opinion, because and this is why Jesus and Paul are phenomenal models, because they give themselves entirely. The church, on the other hand, the bride, is probably more the way that their spirituality is more receiving, and that's its own type of gift. And both the masculine and the feminine parts of this kenosis is very much a letting go. So a model for work that most people would have is to control, to get things done, to manipulate an environment according to your will. But what Jesus does on the cross is the opposite. It's the will of God and the will of others happening to him, and him allowing it. And St. Paul even talks about being poured out as a libation, right? Like part of the spiritual life, and this sounds less masculine, but it does require an incredible amount of courage, is to give up your will, to let go of your will, and to let God's will become yours. So it's as if, how like when you're drowning, you're fighting the water. All you got to do is relax, and your body will just float. You know what I mean? And then you're fine. So like when you're trying to, like, you don't master yourself by beating a sin, by working at that sin necessarily. You do it by allowing God to work through you. And so part of the masculine spirituality is to be a receiver of God's will, right? And only in that context to then give yourself away. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. So there's, the way that I would talk about this on psychological terms is that there's only a short-term benefit to essentially bury what you're experiencing. So like, let's say you have you have a porn addiction. It's like, well, in the first 30 days, there's a lot of things that you can do that are surface level that will help get you on the right track. Like, don't bring your phone into your bedroom. Do something distracting in the shower, like take a cold one, or listen to music, or have a 2-year-old who never lets you go to the bathroom by yourself. Like really tangible, practical stuff. Not the 2-year-old thing isn't, but the tangible, practical stuff.
Yeah.
That you can do, and you can also essentially say, like, I'm going to try and ignore and push out and fight against these thoughts and these tendencies. It's a short-term fix. Even if it works over the course of the first 30 days, the thing is going to resurface itself, because what you're actually in need of when you have a manifestation of sin that's externalizing itself, it's really a wounded part of you that's trying to protect you from something, that's trying to act on something that needs healing. And the only way to heal it is in and through a relationship. Like, we're broken in relationship and we're healed in relationship. So it's like there has to be a letting go of control and effort and thinking, I got myself into this mess, I'm going to get out of it. You have to actually let go of that.
That's right.
Turn toward the pain and turn toward the relationship in order to bring about the healing. And St. Paul totally models that. And he talks about it all the time in a very masculine way of like, I boast in my weakness, and I'm going to tell you I boast in my weakness because it's so counterintuitive.
It is, and it's so countercultural. Like, I'm not a big social media guy, but I have heard enough from fellow young adults and so forth about the red pill movement.
Yes.
So, there's different models for, masculinity and for work. And Paul would be, I guess, the antithesis of the red pill movement, right?
Explain why he would be that way. Yeah. Push
Well, I
push
don't
into
know
that.
enough. I don't know enough about the red pill movement, but I think it's more of the former, where you're to use another to follow the context of what you were talking about before. The Seinfeld episode, "Master of Your Domain."
Yes. Yes.
So they would say, like, I'm master of my domain. I'm going to say what my goal is. I'm going to make it happen. Um, and I'm in control. I'm in control of the situation, and I'm going to manipulate the environment to match my desires. That's kind of, let's say that that's the secular movement today. And Paul is on the other hand this kenosis driven figure who is giving up his will to God and constantly growing. I think one thing we have to talk about today is the process of sanctification in Paul and how he changes dramatically in his life. And you can see it in his letters, early letters versus later letters. How his focus changes, how his vocabulary changes, all that stuff, and how he grows as a human being. But he's letting, like, one thing I've noticed about the secular types of masculinity is that they're static individuals. Like, from college until 70 years old, same vocabulary, same goals, same TV channels, same sports teams. The players keep changing. It's just the colors of the uniform that stays the same. Anyway, that's a Seinfeld thing too. So, all I'm trying to say is that, yeah, Paul is adapting, changing, growing, all because he's allowing the Holy Spirit to guide him.
So there's two really important topics that we need to break open on what you just brought up, and I want to hear more about how Paul changed, because it's really important. Just to clarify, red pilling is awakening to a harsh truth. Like, that's what red pilling is. So there's a way in which an encounter with St. Paul red pills you, where it's like it's not um it's not strength and you just push through and it's all about the will and you kind of get things done. St. Paul is somebody who over time surrenders more and more and more of himself. Now there's a red pill misogyny thing, but in general, it's from the Matrix, and you take the red pill and you awaken to reality. That's sort of the
Okay. All
general
right. So
vibe
there
of
could
red
be a
pilling.
Christian element to that.
Yeah, there is a Christian element to being red pilled by Christianity. But what I want to press into here is something I don't know. It's like chicken or the egg. I want to. I think I want to get to sanctification second. And I want to talk about this first, which is the paradox of 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 pouring yourself out and laying your will down for God's will to be done. There's a really counterintuitive thing that takes place, and I want to talk about this actually from Taylor Swift. So Taylor Swift has this song. It's called New Year's Day, and one of the main refrains is it's like a love song. It's like, please don't ever become a stranger whose life I could recognize anywhere. And it's actually an expression of what happens when you live life outside of an intimate relationship with God. It's what happens when you don't lay your life down. You actually end up living a life that looks the same across the board. There are only a certain number of sins. Like, all gangsters look the same ultimately. They all end up looking the same. They all end up living the same life. They all have the same problems. The drinking, the women, the domestic violence, like across the board, it ends up being the exact same life. But when you look at the saints, the masters of surrendering their will, of giving their life to God, God always gives them their life back in the most unique, you can't ever duplicate it,
Diverse, very
profound,
diverse.
diverse way. Yeah. St.
Yeah.
Francis, St. Therese of Lisieux, St. Paul, like they're wildly different. St. John of the Cross, St. John Chrysostom, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena, they're radically different from each other. And they're radically different expressions of God. And it's this idea that when you give your life over to God, he gives it back to you in a truly unique and powerful way. And one of the reasons why I was thinking about this, because it's somewhat counterintuitive. If you spend time with you and spend time with St. Paul, I'm not like, oh yeah, that guy's definitely modeling St. Paul, because your personalities, I've experienced them differently. But you've like followed the principles of St. Paul. And in doing so, like God has given you back to yourself in ways that are really unique to you. So you're not a mini St. Paul. You're more authentically Brian when you model St. Paul. And so it's this total paradoxical thing that if you really were in the culture and you wanted to be authentic and you wanted to be unique, the straightest arrow path to being truly unique and fully alive is to surrender your life to God. And it's this total paradox.
Yeah, it is a paradox. And in addition to what you said, I feel like every human being models so many people, some conscious, some unconscious. So I don't think I ever one day said, I'm going to model Paul. I don't think I ever made that conscious decision. I think I observed over time that I was doing things in a Pauline way. And then I deduced that, oh, he must be a role model of mine. You know what I mean? I
Sure.
Anybody who knows me and my dad knows that, I definitely model my dad in some ways. I definitely model both of my grandfathers, right? All are excellent people. So I'm a mix of many things, and I'm also a product of my age. So if I were born in medieval Europe, I would probably have very different influences. But because I live in 21st century United States, Paul is a perfect model for my job, because we are living in an apostolic environment here in northern New Jersey, 21st century United States, So the apostolic figure is very helpful to me in my work.
Okay, so tell me about St. Paul changing over time and why sanctification is so important.
How much time do you have? I think it's worth just briefly talking about Paul's upbringing and his models. So Paul was not a fan of Jesus or Christians early on, and his models were the great rabbis. So he comes from Tarsus, which is like in modern day Turkey. But then as some youth, he moves to Jerusalem and he studies under Hillel the Elder, who was a great Pharisee. And even the Bible says that Gamaliel was probably a friend to Christians. He was at least warm to them and kind to them. So Gamaliel was one of the top two prominent rabbis of his time. And Gamaliel was a grandson of Hillel the Elder, maybe the greatest of the rabbis that existed before Jesus. So these rabbis of Paul's time and before, the great sages of the Jewish faith, they had a work ethic that was kind of shared and understood. So Hillel, you would imagine that this guy was he was such an icon that he would be wealthy and paid for being a rabbi. No, he chopped wood for a living 6 days a week. And then 1 day a week on the Shabbat, he would express himself in the synagogue or whatever, right? So this guy was a day laborer. And the term that Maimonides uses is the working sage. So the great rabbis of Paul's time were hard day laborers, and they took no money for their wages as a religious leader. So these guys were coal miners, iron smelters. They would be people who carry water. Before indoor plumbing, there were water carriers. That was a career, a profession. And some of the great rabbis were doing this stuff. So that who was Paul learning from? It was from these working sages who refused to take an income for their ministry. And that kind of helped build up their legend. Because what did that say? It said that these guys are normal guys, working hard, family men. And, Psalm 1 says, blessed is he who studies the law of the Lord day and night. Right? So how are these rabbis like working hard, raising a family, good husbands, good fathers, good workers? And then in addition to that, students of the law of the Lord. It was a nighttime thing. So the rabbis were night studiers. They would probably go on less sleep than what is healthy. And then over the nights of work, they daytime physical labor, nighttime spiritual labor. Then on the Sabbath, finally, they're delivering what they've gleaned from the scriptures, right? So that is the background for Paul. And how about Jesus? So, Paul eventually becomes this follower of Jesus. Was Jesus a laborer? Yeah. And was it a high position kind of labor? No, it was kind of underwhelming. Even the Nazareans, when they're saying, like, isn't this the son of a carpenter? So Jesus comes from a no-name town, has a very unimpressive job. Like a true son of Abraham would have land and servants. Joseph, none of that. Probably got paid on a daily basis. If he didn't work, he probably just didn't eat. And without Joseph around, Jesus was probably supporting Mary. So Jesus was this everyday, get up, sore bones, sore muscles, cold, wet, rainy day, got to get up anyway, So these were the models for Paul. And I feel like that background is important before we get into the other stuff. But any thoughts about this?
No, keep going. Keep going.
I don't want to dominate the conversation. I think that's really important. So I think Paul started off as he's blinded by the light of Jesus on the road to Damascus. You would think, like, all right, he gets baptized and then boom, he's going west to preach to the Gentiles immediately. Well, if you look deeply, he goes to Arabia, he goes back home to Tarsus, and for 3 years, kind of keeps a low profile. And it's a rather contemplative 3 years of discipleship. So, how long did Jesus disciple the 12? 3 years. How long did St. Paul disciple Timothy? 3 years, right? And Paul himself goes on, like, let's call it a 3-year contemplative reassessment of Judaism. And this is where non-Catholic Christians sometimes really get Paul wrong. They see Paul as departing from Judaism. No. He reassesses his Judaism. And it's not because he's so critical of his own kind. He himself is the most qualified of Jews, studied under the greatest rabbi, totally fulfilled the law in compared to others before his conversion to Christianity. So he critiques Jews because he is one and because he never left it. And he sees his Christianity as a continuation of his Judaism. So it takes him like 3 years to kind of wrap his head around this whole Jesus thing and the idea of God becoming a human being, which is, kind of inconceivable, even though there's hints of that. There's hints of that in the Old Testament, but it's just kind of hard to wrap your mind around. So I want to identify Paul early on as a contemplative. So we established him as a worker, a day laborer, right? But also as a contemplative.
Was his trade was tent making? Is that what his trade was?
We don't know. We know that he made tents in Corinth, and we're going to talk about that. But one thing we could say is that he had a really intense work ethic. So intense that people had a hard time ministering with him. So, once we established that he's a contemplative laborer and he's not afraid of physical work, right? So he's also a little too intense and works so hard that on his first missionary journey, he takes Barnabas and John Mark with him, and John Mark just can't keep up. Mark ended up writing a gospel, so he's clearly a good guy, who we trust, right? But Mark and Paul, they just couldn't work together because Paul was too intense. They nearly kill. They're nearly killed in like in Lystra and Derbe, and John Mark is like, "All right, they almost killed us. We got away with it. We're done, right? We're gonna go back home now, right?" And Paul's like, "No, we're going to the next city." And Mark's like, "What? Why would we do that?" So Paul, I think, was too intense for a lot of people, and sometimes even hard to work with because of the level of his intensity. So that's where I get into the bravery. Like the guy, he nearly gets killed. They think that he's dead, which is why they stop throwing stones at him. And then he gets up and he does it again.
Okay, so we've got intense worker. We've got taking real serious time to understand who he is in light of God, who God is, and what the call is. And then he goes out with a tremendous amount of intensity and purpose that is unwavering, really. There's a degree of stubbornness there.
Yes. It is. So stubbornness has
or persistence, maybe is a positive term.
Yeah, stubbornness has a negative connotation, and fortitude would be the positive side of the same inclination, if you will. So he had a lot of just perseverance. He had an indomitable spirit. No human being was going to get in the way of his divine given mission.
No power, no principality, no nothing, no death nor life.
Yeah, so kind of fearless, fearless. Yeah. Can I talk about his shrewdness?
No, just keep going. Yeah,
so
awesome.
St. Paul was a crafty guy. He was a crafty guy. You would expect Christians to be these like innocent lambs, just kind of like being led to the slaughter, right? He was not afraid of the slaughter. But at the same time, he was a Roman citizen, trained well, fully literate, and not a great speaker, but good enough, serviceable speaker. Public. You're probably a better speaker than he was, but proficient in the Roman world, and a worldly. He was aware enough of the worldly mechanisms so that he could employ those worldly mechanisms to his evangelization purposes. So many examples. I'm only going to provide a few for the sake of time, but the diocesan system in the Roman world was an evil, crushing mechanism that was designed to service the good of the emperor and of the Roman Empire. So it was like a hub and spoke system, like to compare it to like a modern airport system. But Rome was the worldwide hub, and then the spokes of that were the colonies, like Corinth, like Caesarea Maritima, Philippi, and so forth. And those colonies had rights and responsibilities and funding and awesome ports, right? So if Caesar ever wanted to collect a tax, basically small cities and towns surrounding the colonies would pay their tax to the colony, and then the colony would pay its share of the tax to Rome. Diseases would spread, from little towns to colonies to Rome, and new laws that needed to be promulgated would start in Rome with Caesar and then go through a public speaking, eloquent, rhetoric trained herald, right, in a colony, and then that would then be repeated so back and forth. That's how information spread. This was an evil system. What does St. Paul do? He takes that evil system that most Christians would say, "Oh, we're not gonna operate in that. It's created by Rome for Rome. It's not at all Christian or Jewish." St. Paul has no scruples at all using that system to spread Christianity. So when he gets the dream to go west and to go into Macedonia, it's fascinating. If you look at the cities he chooses, they're all primarily Roman colonies. So he preaches in a Roman colony. He establishes a bishop, an episcopoi, with the charge to start priests and to put a priest in every town. And he basically uses the diocesan system to spread Christianity in the Greek-speaking world. So the structure of the Catholic Church is based off of this, and we still use the diocesan system today, right? Which was originally it was monstrous, but it became the way in which the church spread, so very crafty. He traveled for free by using the appeal system. Like somebody, and he kept himself alive longer, to preach longer, by using his citizenship and manipulating that citizenship to live longer, travel for free, spread the gospel. Very, very innovative, crafty guy.
Okay, so definitely fortitude, passion, hard work, and then shrewd.
Shrewd, crafty. Jesus says, "Be as shrewd as serpents." It's kind of a surprising statement. Jesus in Luke 16 praises the craftiness of the dishonest steward. Right?
Yes.
Of course, dishonesty is no good. Paul was very honest, but that dishonest steward was so good with the ways of the world. Paul is that child of light who is as crafty as Caesar or as any good politician, right? He was both of those things, and he used those things to his advantage. As an evangelist today, I'm always tempted to ignore social media because it's evil. It's an evil system. I just kind of want to opt out. But is that what Paul would do? No, he'd use it to his advantage. Right?
It's not the system that's evil, right? It's the way in which it's being leveraged.
Well, I think that the way that a lot of these algorithms are built, there are some innate, intrinsic things that are just kind of wrong,
Yeah, but, I mean, it's like,
and that's out of our control,
It's about putting like addictive things in food that's actually terrible for you, but really cheap to make because somebody wants to make a lot of money, right? but the highway
You
system
know
of
what else it is?
communication.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you know what else social media is? It's like saying there's only two food choices. Let's say there's hundreds of food choices. It would be the equivalent would be like, okay, you only get two food choices. That's where the algorithms go. They kind of
It's
like divide you.
yeah, and it's designed to destroy your brain. I mean, and it's designed to destroy your soul. Like I get fed stuff. Like if I just started social media, I'll immediately get fed stuff that is like trying to get me addicted to things that aren't good for me. Even just the doom scroll in and of itself. It's like, oh, I can get someone to stay on my social media platform for a really long time if I make it short, and they just start getting rolling on that. Like shorts are devastating for people, devastating for their brains, devastating.
Ironic how TikTok started giving people tics.
Yeah.
Like it's in the name.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be smiling.
What's next for St. Paul? Okay, so he's now traveling. He's now being super courageous. What's next for him?
Well,
Or what's
I think
another
this.
thing you admire about him?
I think that he could challenge Americans and ancient Romans in um, forfeiting his rights. So I feel like this could be connected to his shrewdness, his craftiness. But in America and in Rome, people were always fighting for their rights. And of course, fighting for your rights is a good thing. The idea of justice is a very good thing, right? But St. Paul will oftentimes, in his evangelization, recognize that he has a right to do something and then give up that right and then leverage that sacrifice to promote the gospel.
What's an
You know where I'm
example?
going? Well, he gives a litany of examples in 1 Corinthians 9. So I think it might be worth backing up a little bit and to talk about Corinth. Corinth in St. Paul's time would have been like a Las Vegas of the United States today. So it was a port city. That's not like Las Vegas. But sailors, it had a giant port, and sailors would be pouring in on a regular basis with tons of money to blow. And who knows where the term spending money like a drunken sailor came from, but maybe from Corinth. And there were all these like pagan temples with like really hedonistic weekend rituals that involve drinking, eating meat, lots of prostitution, partying, stuff like that. So Corinth was a very secular, very hedonistic, very money-centered place, very wealthy place. And the people of Corinth were very attached to money. So in a place where people are quick to spend money on partying, but slow to spend money on their faith development or on building up the church or on serving the poor, St. Paul recognized that fault of the Corinthians and did something very special, did a few special things to be more appealing to the Corinthians as he was evangelizing to them. And he mentions two things in 1 Corinthians. He says, number one, that he as an apostle has the right to earn an income with his preaching, to be paid by the community that he preaches to, but that he waives that right for their sake. And it indeed he did win these Corinthians by preaching to them for free, because if he would have charged them something, they might have been less inclined to even participate to begin with.
Mm.
It shows their low level of spirituality, which is apparent in all of the two letters to the Corinthians. But St. Paul makes a personal sacrifice and waives his right to an income for his preaching because he feels like that's what the Corinthians need, right? So what is that? It's a willingness to make a self-sacrifice. This is kenotic, right? He's pouring himself out and sacrificing himself for the sake of the Corinthian community. Now, is there any evidence of Paul doing that in Philippi or in Ephesus? No, right? Or, it seems that he's only doing this in Corinth because this is a particular need of the Corinthians. So it shows that he's willing to change his tactics. It shows that he's willing to work hard again, right? He's imitating the working sages, Rabbi Hillel, Gamaliel, and even the great Rabbi Jesus, right?
Hmm.
There was another great Rabbi, Yehoshua, not our Jesus, right? So anyway, he and just like the great elders, here he is. He's making tents in Corinth, and he finds a group to do it with. Priscilla and Aquila are exiles from Rome, and they're in Corinth, and they start this tent building business. Why? Because Corinth was also the site of the great Isthmian Games, which happened every 3 years on years where the Olympian Games weren't happening. And a small city of maybe 100,000 people in Corinth became a city of like 250,000 people when the Corinthian Games were happening, and there wasn't hotels and housing. So you needed tents for people to live in, athletes, coaches, spectators. There needed to be tents. And St. Paul recognized, there's a demand for tents. Let's make some tents. So 6 days a week, 6 days a week, making tents in the night, praying, studying, preparing Talmuds, right? And homilies and sermons. And then preaching on the day of the sun, right? The Christian Sabbath. So what is that? It's kind of like a combination of his Paul the working sage, willing to work hard, his craftiness, right? His willingness to share his labor with somebody else. So he calls Priscilla and Aquila co-workers in the Lord. He's finding help and counting lay people as co-workers, even women. So he's building a team. He's a team builder. And he's increasing his capacity in his team building.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is like shaped by love, on mission for love and redemption. It then creates a degree of flexibility and intentionality for St. Paul, in which he's like, I can be whatever you need to be for the sake of love.
He says, I could be all things to all.
But
right?
it's not like, so there's this concept of like healthy accompaniment, where it's like 1 foot in the water, 1 foot on the shore, where it's like 1 foot in the water of the person's subjective experience, but always maintaining 1 foot on the shore of truth. So like I
like that.
I could be in someone's subjective experience and be like, yes, that is really hard. Or like the best example of this is with your children. It's like, yesterday, Maggie she was trying to pour water into her cup and she couldn't get it to work. And so she chucked the cup. And it's like 1 foot in the water that was really frustrating. I would be really frustrated too if I was trying to do something and get what I needed and I couldn't do it. 1 foot on the shore but it's not okay for you to throw your cup. Like the baby's right there, other people all around. Like you expressing your frustration in a virtuous way is better than what you did. And I feel that from St. Paul. It's like I can be all things to all people. I can put 1 foot in any water I need to put my foot in. But I'm always going to have 1 foot on the shore, which is the good truth and beauty of the gospel. And in light of love, like I remember this one time we had a conversation, maybe this is more practical. where I got a call. We were doing campus ministry together, and I was a student, and I got a call from a student who was like, "Hey, I know you just turned 21. I'm kind of SOL on getting beer this evening. Like, would you mind going and buying me beer?" She was underage. And I called you on the phone, and I was like, I bet she would. I had been trying to get her to go to mass, and she wasn't going to mass. And I was like, I bet I could get her to come to mass if I buy her beer. And I was like, Brian, what do I do? And you were like, yeah, you don't buy someone underage beer to get them to come to mass, But
Well, so the shrewdness, without honesty or keeping one foot on the shore, right? That we're not the dishonest steward,
right.
right. We're commending the prudence of the dishonest steward, not the dishonest. Yeah. So that was the right decision. I'm glad I told you that.
Yeah. No, yeah, me too. So I just think I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind in St. Paul, because I think we can go too far pastorally and be like, oh, I'll model St. Paul in the workplace by just being whatever my boss needs me to be, by pouring myself out in work. And a lot of the spiritual masters will talk about like the art of pouring yourself out as a reservoir and not as a channel, where it's an outpouring, it's an overflow. You never actually empty up, like until you give your life over, you never actually like empty yourself of the love and gift and grace of God. It's just sort of like this constant overflow. It's like why Jesus spent all night in prayer, right? And it's just like you're giving all the way over. And I think that there's like a real problem in church ministries of like, oh, I'll justify not setting boundaries in my work. And this is in other contexts too, not just in church ministry. But I'll justify not setting healthy boundaries for the sake of outpouring self. And it's like, I don't think St. Paul was doing that. I don't think that he was like pouring himself out to the point of burning out. I think he was like constantly replenishing and sticking on one foot in on the shore of truth at all times. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I think he did have his ups and downs.
Say more about
And
that.
well, I mean, he writes about it. I think he has moments of anger, moments of depression. There's moments where he is deserted by nearly everybody, and moments where it seems like his ministry is kind of going nowhere. He experiences a lot of rejection. I think St. Paul probably had like baseball statistics in his ministry career, and he probably had a lot more losses than wins.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think of him as this master, which he was, but he experienced a lot of rejection, both physical and spiritual rejection, and was double crossed by a lot of people. He has litanies of sufferings. He'll go on like 3 times he was scourged, 40 times -1. He's been shipwrecked twice. I mean, just one thing after another. He went through cold. He spent nights, entire evenings floating in the water, freezing, starving. You know what I mean? Like, the poor guy went through a ton, right? So he definitely had the dark moments and went through bouts of anger with even his coworkers. And it seems like he was able to reconcile with a lot of people. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that he had ups and downs, but he did have that virtue of fortitude. He did persevere. And he writes about how he got through this stuff. Like there were things that he prayed for that never got resolved, and he had to just rely on grace. There were other moments where he had to really beef up and develop the theological virtue of hope. And he writes intensely and develops this theological virtue of hope further than really anybody else in Scripture. Just read Romans alone. I mean, you could just follow the theme of hope throughout, even though it's about many other things. Start with Romans 5, go to Romans 8. He talks about how hope comes from endurance, and endurance comes from proven character, and proven character comes from suffering, right? So he wrestles with all of the afflictions that he endures, and to me, he has to work that out over the life of the time of his life. We're talking about a decades-long ministry with a lot of growth and change, you know?
Where did he end up?
What do you mean?
I mean, you talk about where he was. Where did he end up? Like he changed over time, and like who was St. Paul at the time of his death?
Yeah, can I just talk a little bit about where he started?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
no, please.
go,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think he's the odd apostle, because there was the 12 that spent 3 years with Jesus, and everybody knew who those 12 were. You know, they were in the list of the apostles who were called by Jesus. And then Jesus dies, resurrects, ascends. The disciples are dispersed throughout the nations. And then there's this odd duck, Paul, who's also called by Jesus, right? But this is after the ascension, and there's only a few people there for the calling. And for the rest of Paul's life, especially early on, though, he constantly feels like he has to prove and justify his apostleship in Jesus. And he's always saying, like, he always starts his not always, oftentimes starts his letters with Paul, an apostle of Christ, right? Called by Jesus himself, right? And sometimes he says, like he differentiates himself from the other apostles. Why? Because he has a chip on his shoulder, right? It seems that there's a lot of people who are saying, and it's never said, but you can tell that by his constant justification of his apostleship, that he has to kind of like state that he is an apostle because there's somebody else saying that he's not, right? So he has a chip on his shoulder. He's a little bit angry. He feels like he has to prove himself to others. And if you read his early letters, Galatians, Corinthians might be a little later, but he has a zeal that is more of the zeal of Phineas and Aaron, right? And Jesus cleansing the temple, that kind of zeal. And it's less the zeal of a sage who has time on his hands, right? It's almost like he's in a hurry. And he's willing to do things himself early on. And as he gets older and wiser, it seems like he's willing to take on co-workers, that he's more gentle. He's okay with imperfection for a longer period of time. Read Romans 14 and 15. That's a little later on. And he says, put up with the imperfections of others and try to please others. Make sacrifices. And he says that, he models it in 1 Corinthians 9, giving up his rights to both compensation and marriage, right? Something the other apostles, especially Cephas, Peter, he has the right to take a wife. He has the right to get paid. He takes that. St. Paul forfeits both of those rights. And just like the early Christians in Rome, they have the right to eat meat that isn't necessarily kosher. but he says, like, if the Jewish Christians can't handle non-kosher meat, and even though all foods are clean, just eat vegetables. If that's going to make the Jewish Christians happy, just eat vegetables. Give up the meat just to make them happy. Right? So what he's saying is, like, it's these little things, and what you're allowed to do. Don't worry about that. Focus on building up the community. Make personal sacrifice. Like, Christianity is brilliantly individualistic. We care about individuals, their lives, their rights, right? But it's okay for people in their individualistic freedom to give up their individual rights for the sake of the good of the common, right? For the sake of the community. So Christianity it's not Confucianism, which is forget about individuals. It's just about the community. It's not Descartes, just, and Rousseau, like, individuals only, forget about the community. But it's this wonderful synthesis of both, all in the context of using one's freedom to build up, right? And St. Paul is constantly growing in that understanding. And as he realizes that the second coming, the parousia, isn't coming for some amount of time, he starts getting more patient with people. And he also begins to build a succession plan, because he realizes, like, oh my gosh, like before it was just me until Jesus came. Well, if Jesus's second coming is not necessarily immediate, I need to build a succession plan. So then he starts really focusing. If you read the last letters that he writes, he goes from looking down and he starts to look up on the horizon. He starts talking about his death. He starts talking about succession. He starts talking about the hierarchy, deacons, priests, and presbyters, and episcopoi, bishops, and he gives the qualifications for each thing. These are the qualifications for priests. This is the qualifications for bishop. And these are the letters of Timothy and Titus, right? Where it's all about succession and building up and making the community strong, right? And he starts talking about his death, right? So his process of sanctification goes from, a one-man mission with, like, maybe one disciple, to, like, building up communities, building up a structure, a hierarchy, and being much more patient with progress in people.
A developmental worldview.
I would say so. Yeah, and it puts the church on the trajectory to take over the Roman Empire, which is pretty cool. So it's not something he could have imagined himself. But Christianity becomes so ingrained in the culture that by the 4th century, it becomes synthesized.
So as we near our end here, what of the things that you're talking about, like, how do you apply it practically into your life? Like, he's your model here professionally, as an evangelist, as a man. Like, what do you think about when you think of modeling St. Paul? Like, is it everything you've talked about, or what would be like a closing thought here?
Well, I think the only way in which I'm not totally imitating Paul is by putting my life at risk on a regular basis. and we chose different marital vocations. Like, he really chose that celibate life, and leveraged all that extra time he had into promoting the gospel. So, I don't have that kind of time that he earned for himself by choosing celibacy. But still, he's very easy to imitate personally. The overall kenosis mentality that he has, he imitated Jesus in the same way, emptying himself. I try to imitate him in his fortitude, in his perseverance, his indomitable spirit, his craftiness, his team building, uh, his ability to grow as a coworker. So his willingness to use neutral, secular organizations and systems to promote the gospel, right? These are all things in which I would say I imitate him. I'm also very motivated by the working sages that preceded him.
I remember when I was first starting speaking, and I was like, what should I do about money? And what should I charge? And how should I charge? And you were like, I'm the worst person in the world to ask that, because I follow Paul. And I'm like, if you want to give me something, you can give me something. If you don't want to give me anything, don't give me anything. And I drove your wife, Annie, a little bit crazy because she invited me to do the retreat. And I was like, well, I'm sorry. I've grown up in the school of Brian Honsberger, who is in the school of St. Paul. And I'm like, I'm coming. Pay what you pay. And that being somewhat frustrating, but also being like, well, like I feel called by God to be here. I feel called by God to come do this. And it isn't necessarily money. You've just given me so much to think about. You know me, I'm rarely silent for extended periods of time. It's just given me a
Yeah,
lot to
I
think
feel
about.
like I did all the talking. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, it's because it was like sitting at the feet of St. Paul in some ways, and his story and his life. I think what is really sticking out to me is the rejection of St. Paul, and how often he tried and fell short, and how often he had to realize and really discern what his contribution was to the rejection. And I look at St. Paul as very aspirational. I was baptized at St. Paul inside the walls. My
Your
dad's name is
son?
Paul. My son's middle name is Paul. There's so many different. I don't see myself. I try not to be a pain about it, but I don't see myself as a convert. I see myself as a Jew who has been fulfilled in the experience of Christianity, and that the Jewish tradition is an integral part of my Christianity, and of my following of Jesus. I read Jewish spirituality, right? Like I have so much love for him, and I'm kind of coming out of this period of really being cut down. Probably 2018 to 2021 was a 3-year period for me of like being cut down and being built back up again, and having faced so much rejection and just this continuous effort to pour yourself out in the face of human fragility. And that perseverance of Paul, I wasn't expecting to come into the conversation thinking about that, but it is so critical to being a good husband and a good father and a good professional, is that like you're just going to get knocked down far more times than you desire. And it's not really about that. It's really about the response. It's really about your response and whether or not you're going to let God make the most of being knocked down. You're going to draw meaning from it, as St. Paul. You're going to grow in character. You're going to grow in perseverance because of whatever suffering you endure. And I think it's just so meaningful, and is true, and is truly masculine. Of this idea of I'm willing to take on perpetual growth, and not this misogynistic view of failure, which is see no evil, hear no evil. I can't do any wrong, and you all have to fall in line with me. So a lot for me to reflect on. So thanks for spending this time mentoring me through St. Paul. It's really meaningful.
It's my pleasure to be a part of this and to continue our friendship. And it's the true model of discipleship. Paul was a disciple, and I am, and you are, and we're all in this constant state of growth and sanctification led by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and I also want to say this last thing to people listening. It's like, I don't have a singular mentor. I don't have a singular person that I go to for all things. And I am constantly, I basically have a rule of thumb. If it's a certain type of decision that I need to make, or a certain type of challenge I'm facing, there are certain people that I'm like, I know God has put you in my life. And I know for this reason to help walk with me in this context. And one of my favorite things about our friendship is like, whenever it is I need a biblical perspective on something, whenever it is that I need to look at this in light of the historical church, and the historical Catholicism, it's like, well, where was the origin, and how did we get here, and what can we learn from that? There's just so much wisdom. I get to stand on the shoulder of the giantness of your study and your understanding, your historical understanding of Christian figures, Jewish figures, and schools of thought. So I always appreciate you being there for me.
Don't come to me if you're looking to make more money.
No, never have, never will. All right, everybody. Always good to be with you. God bless you. Remember, you were made to do hard things. And thanks to our friends at FIO for making this possible.